Hello everybody, my name is Miriam Cosic and it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome Ramona Koval this morning. Not that Ramona needs any introduction at all to book lovers. For years she brought us texts and writers and their ideas on the book show on Radio National, as you all know. Now, I don't know about you, but I was appalled when she left the book show. And you know, I was almost annoyed and hurt, as though a good friend had suddenly left town without any consultation or explanation or anything, which shows you how intimate a medium the radio is. Because although Ramona and I have been rattling around the book world for a number of years, we only actually met each other this morning, and yet because of the book show, I feel as though I've known you for years. Anyway, luckily for us, Ramona has been using her time fruitfully since she left, and she's written this delightful book called, do we have a copy of it? Yeah. It's called By the Book, A Reader's Guide to Life, which is a kind of memoir and a critical reading guide rolled into one. So I thought I'd structure our conversation today by letting the book guide us through a conversation. I'll call for questions at the very end. And while I'm doing housekeeping, I just remembered I should have reminded you to turn your phones off, please. And if you're tweeting, the hashtag is ADLWW, and Ramona will be signing her books afterwards. But back to Ramona and the book as our guide. I thought we'd start at the start and talk to you about your childhood and how the world of books opened up to you. I was delighted in the very first chapter to rediscover things I had completely forgotten, like the golden books, like the story of Grace Darling, having saved the people in the shipwreck in the 4th grade reader, which I haven't thought about since primary school. Well, tell us something.
Well, I think we have a problem with my microphone. Is that better? Oh.
Yeah, got it.
You thought I'd forgotten about how to use a microphone, didn't you? I should just say, just before I answer the question about those childhood books, there's nothing more intimate than having someone's voice in your ears for years and years, and I know that that's how I feel about listening to things on the radio and getting used to someone's voice and getting used to the way someone thinks, and having a friend on the radio, and that's how I see the people I listen to, and that's how I'm sure other people heard me. So I must apologise for making you feel as if your friend had left town without consultation. I'll just say that if you've ever been in love and then you've fallen out of love, you know what it is. You go to a point where you think there's no way you can go back. Imagine yourself back in love when you've passed the point of no return. We've all been in that situation, I'm sure, so you will understand my decision to pack up in the middle of the night and leave town quietly. When I had finished being on the radio, I went and spoke to the publishers at Text about an idea I had about writing a book, and they said, yes, we'd like you to write that book, but before you write that book, we'd like you to write another book, which was for me a sort of a fantastic idea that Michael Hayward had said to me, would you write a book about reading? Because you've been reading for so long, and you must have got some things to say about reading. And I thought to myself, yes, I do have a lot of things to say about reading, and what a great idea. So I went home and I looked at all the books that had made it from the office to my house. And as you know, Miriam, you know, there are books that you use at work and you write about, and then you leave because you think, well, I've done that book, I've dealt with it, I don't need to have it with me.
It doesn't become part of your life.
Some of them do. And then I looked at the books that I had, that had survived the culls of the marriages, the divorces, the marriages, the divorces. And this book has stayed with me longer than any husband has stayed with me. And why? And what about these books that I've carried around since I was a kid? And what about reading? And what about the first things I read and learnt to read? And you're referring to those things that the first books that I had that were mine, the Little Golden Book. My parents were very poor, and four of us lived in a one-bedroom flat for many, many years, and we didn't have a lot of books around except for the Little Golden Book that you bought at the newsagent, because and the little red hen was the one that I remember.
And you mentioned in the book.
And I mentioned in the book about this, you know about the little red hen, and she just seemed to me to be so lacking in fun, and she just always was doing what she had to do, and then in the end, when she baked this bread, she didn't share it. I just thought she wasn't really a role model, as far as I can see. But I do remember the book, and then that led to the Noddy books, Noddy and Big Ears, and these were the sort of books that were the introduction to reading for me. I didn't have parents who read to me like The Wind in the Willows and The Gumnut Babies and May Gibbs and everything, and all of those books passed me by. But it was these other ones that were actually designed for post-war children in the mass market in America. The Little Red Hen books, the Golden books.
Yeah, and they were sort of morale boosters and teachers as well, weren't they?
Like a lot of children's literature, it's about sort of moral imperatives and getting you to, be the little engine that could, and the little red hen that did.
Having said that, and those terrific memories of our childhood books, which we all shared, being Australians, you were also a very precocious reader. I mean, Kafka in primary school.
The Kafka story is that, my mother took me to the library, but it was the bus library, and I'm sure you had mobile libraries here too, that were, had a small group of books that were taken off around the suburbs and into the regions, of course, if you're not from a city. And I think because my parents were non-English speakers, that the idea of the library, and they weren't educated, the library was a little bit too formal for them, and they felt that they might need to know something that they didn't know. How do you actually go in there and do it? But the bus was big enough to have its measure, and the bus librarian, the man at the end of the bus, gave me a card, and it was laminated, and I just felt so special that I had this card, and you could read anything. And because I wasn't really attracted to animals that talk, which seemed to be a lot of the children's books, and I would lie on the floor of the bus library. It was lino, and it was cool, and the smell of it was very much what I associate with libraries. And if you're lying on the bottom and you're at the children's sections over here and the adult section is there, you find that you're actually lying where the K's are, and you've got Kafka and Koestler and all of the other K's. But the Kafka, it's just such a little book, The Trial. It's not very big at all. And I thought, well, that looks like it's a kid-sized book. And I pulled it out and I asked him, like sort of Oliver Twist, may I have this one, or may I have some more? And he said, this is not for children. And I said, well, I've read all the ones for children. I lied. And he said, well, then you may have it. So he entrusted me with this book, The Trial. So I went home and read The Trial. And actually, if you read it in a certain way, like a child does, it is a very simple story. I mean, you're just not reading all the layers. And it's a story about somebody who is getting into trouble for something he doesn't know what he's done, and all this mystery about people coming investigating him and asking, and why are they coming to his house, and what's happening in his, and he's also getting all the wrong, he thinks he's fine, or he thinks that these people he just has to tell them what he's been doing and everything will be fine, but everything's not. And actually I thought to myself, it's actually a story that a child understands, especially if they were from a family like mine, where the mysterious adults never said anything, but you knew there was something terrible that they had in their background, which they weren't talking about. So I think it was probably a perfect book for me to read at that age.
Look, we'll get to that background in a second, but I was fascinated to read the chapter where you talked about your mother's reading, and she was an avid and omnivorous reader, and in English, even though it wasn't her original language, but she read things like Vance Packard and Alvin Toffler and James Joyce. And she left all the books lying around that you could pick up. And she didn't censor anything, did she?
My mother was a self-taught reader. I think her last school class was when she was 11, just in Poland, just before the war broke out. And so she spoke Yiddish and Polish. And then when she lived in France for 5 years, she spoke French. And then she'd learnt German during the war. It was kind of like Yiddish, but you didn't want to get your Yiddish accent observed at that stage, so she had a very good German accent. And then she came to Australia, but she was a factory worker, so she didn't go to classes, so she learnt in the clothing factories in Melbourne in the early 50s. So she was reading French, she was reading Simone de Beauvoir in French when she was in France, but when she was in English by then, she loved the idea of banned books too. So Portnoy's Complaint and Lady Chatterley's Lover and Ulysses, and I always thought that, I knew that they were banned, but actually it turns out that they were just recently unbanned, because where was she going to get them if they were banned? But she didn't move in those literary circles that you could get a sort of samizdat copy of something. But she was a rule breaker in her own way, and she liked reading what other people said she shouldn't read. She liked doing a lot of things that other people said she shouldn't do, but she would leave her books around, and she didn't have any rules about me not reading things. But at the same time, she didn't talk to me about what was in the books either. So, in a sense, because she was so mysterious, I think that I picked up her books like you pick up, a trail of an animal you're hunting, and you say, oh, this is where it's been. And, it stopped here and it ate that. Or, it made a hole here, or this is where it slept for the night. And in a sense, I was tracking my mother through her books and thinking to myself, well, this is where her head has been for the past few weeks. I wonder what she made of it. Or these are the things that she's been thinking about, I assumed. So in that way, I got to read all the books. Not that I really understood. Like, for example, with Ulysses, I knew it was a banned book and there was something in it that was incredibly, controversial. But I never really worked out what it was because, of course, Molly Bloom's soliloquy just completely went over my head. I had no idea what she was talking about. But I thought it must be I think there's a scene of naked swimming, so I thought, oh, well, that must be it. Have taken off their clothes and they don't have bathers on. Anyway, I'm kind of amazed that she read it at all because it's a hard book. I mean, it's not as hard as Finnegan's Whack, but it's really hard, especially if you're not tuned into all the references. How could she be?
And experimental and modernist, and she was really coming to grips with the language.
Yeah.
Your mother was a Holocaust survivor, as was your father, and I mean that must have been the single most formative experience of your childhood. But I wondered, as I was reading the book, as the chapters went on, I was wondering whether your own very voracious reading as a child might have been sort of modelled on hers in the sense of trying to make sense of an insensible world, trying to make sense of a world that was maybe inexplicable, potentially dangerous, potentially terrifying. I mean, you said that you were following in her footsteps, but how do you think that her experience and her reading connect?
My mother survived the war by taking on a false identity. When she was 14, her mother, because she was fair, blue-eyed, blondish, sent her off basically out of a ghetto that they were living in the Polish countryside, and through some kind of strange connections, which I haven't even really found out what they are. I mean, I once went to Poland to try and find this out, and I found that near their village there was some people called, I think their name was Bimbrowski, and they it was very feudal. So there was a sort of a feudal homestead, and all around the villages were people who were on farms, and they were making flour and bread, and that was what the family was doing. But for some reason there was a connection between my great-grandfather and these people. Somehow they got her false papers, and so she became someone else. She became a Polish girl woman of 21 with a different name, a Catholic, who had so she was 14 and she was pretending to be someone who was 21, totally alone in Warsaw.
She had lost her parents.
Well, her father had died when she was a baby, and her mother was back in the ghetto, and eventually they all went to Treblinka. But there she was at 14, being a completely other person and making sure that she survived. Now, that meant that she was a damn fine actress, and if she didn't want to tell you something, there was no way you were going to find out. Yeah. So that was how I think her experience of the war left her, mysterious and complicated, I think. But for me, I mean, it's very odd when you have parents who are victims. You don't kind of feel as if they could actually help you very much or save you, because they are the ones who needed to be saved in a sense. Although now as an adult I can see that they must have been, they must have survived, and although Wisława Szymborska, the fantastic Polish poet, has a wonderful poem which talks about the reasons why people have survived. Sometimes it's complete accident, because you were behind the tree, because you were in front of the tree, because you bent down, because you stood up, because all of these things that for one person it meant that they survived, and another person it meant that they didn't. So she regards it as an accident, and sometimes it is an accident, and sometimes it's kind of rat cunning, and sometimes it's all kinds of reasons why you make a decision and there you are. But I thought of them as the children that they had been, who had been deprived of their parents and of their childhood. So I kind of didn't feel that they were ones you could look to help you in the world. And they couldn't speak English very well, and it was I felt as if I was a bit on my own. So books were the things that told you everything about everything. I mean, there was a book for everything. And I remember there was a wonderful Australian writer called Ivan Southall, and a book called Hill's End I remember reading at school, which was classic children's story about somehow the adults all just get lost. I think, is it a storm or a fire or something happens, and all the adults are gone, and there's only a group of children, and they have to make a new society. And these sorts of books appealed to me because I thought, well, okay, roll up your sleeves. What are we going to do? How would you start? And I think probably that informed a lot of the reading that I did as a child, and actually as an adult too, because I remember being really interested in Robinson Crusoe, for example. I mean, it wasn't a girl's book, but there you are. I mean, a man who... I like the stuff about Man Friday, and that interesting thing about where he suddenly finds a footprint. Does he find one footprint? What? Does that mean that he's a one-legged man? But no, I was confused about the footprint. But what was most interesting to me was that he ends up on the beach with a pipe, some tobacco and a knife. And then from then on, he makes his world. And I thought, how do you make your world like that? What do you do first? How do you make your fort? How do you start hunting things? And I was very interested in that. But that led me to be interested in tales of daring do and the Kon-Tiki expedition, where you have Thor Heyerdahl hopping in onto a raft with 5 other blokes and a whole lot of books and sailing across from Peru to Polynesia to try and prove his theory about how the Polynesians were possibly began by people coming from the east. I love that idea of just getting on a boat and seeing what would happen.
It's all sort of tabula rasa, isn't it? Starting fresh, which is also the immigrant's experience.
Exactly, yeah.
Now I want to fast forward a bit here and get to your university years. And I was surprised after listening to you all those years. I don't know why, but I would have presumed that you'd had a humanities education, but in fact you turned to science. What was it about, what was the lure of science for a girl who'd been a reader of literature all her life?
Well, science has got a couple of really important things, which is an explanation for the way the world is. I love the idea that I learned about the laws of physics. The laws of physics, that meant that you can predict what is going to happen, and it will always happen like that. It turns out it's not quite the same, and it doesn't happen on a molecular level or an atomic level in the same way, but there are other kinds of laws that work at that level. But the idea that, and you have to remember that in 1969 they put a man on the moon. So I was thinking, my God, a parabolic curve, and if you do your calculations in the right way and you work out your velocity to try and escape the atmosphere, and then you kind of end up on the moon. Of all the places you could end up, you're actually in the right spot, and there you are. I thought, this is fantastic. What a huge, powerful, explanatory thing this science is, and chemistry about things combining in certain ways, in the way they always do, and changing different things about biochemistry. I just thought it was fantastic, and it was an explanation for the world that my parents weren't actually able to give me, that this would always happen. It was predictable. I was also interested in genetics, and the way parents and children are similar, and what it is about, what gets passed down. I was interested in nurture and nature. So this is what meant that I was interested in science. But the other thing was that what wonderful poetry there is in science, and how beautiful the explanations can be, about the immune system. And there was this army. I mean, there are all kinds of, you can use all kinds of metaphors, but you had to actually have a story for things that you couldn't see. You have to have a story for the Big Bang and for the way the universe is cooling down, and what happens when meteors come through your atmosphere. I mean, you have to have a beautiful big story, and I found the poetry of science actually more interesting to me than doing the laboratory work, which turned out to be, for me, I mean, I just wasn't the right person to do laboratory work, repeating things to make sure that you got it right, and over and over and over, and I'm too impatient for that. So it turns out that, instead of being the person who put the bricks in the wall of science and all the new information, I was the one who wanted to stand back and say, look at that wall, isn't it fantastic? And really report on it, I suppose, and that's what made me move from being a scientist to science journalism. But it didn't help to have two little babies very young, and in my honours year I had one, and then I had another one a couple of years later, so didn't work. Laboratory work and a bassinet. I was told by my supervisor one Sunday when I terribly put my older daughter under the bench, and she was only about 2 months old, and doing laboratory work in a microbiology laboratory. He was right. It wasn't the right place. But I was so hurt and so upset.
Bad mother,
bad scientist.
It occurs to me, you talk about the stories that science tell and the extra brick in the wall, but it always fascinates me, just even amongst our friends or amongst our colleagues, that you can always see what people's training is. People who've had a legal training have a particular forensic way of looking at things. And the scientific method is very specific. I too had a bit of science in my background, and it always amazes me just reading the opinion pages or listening to the radio, and people don't even understand basic concepts like falsifiability, where they're making an argument. That must have affected your worldview, and it must have affected the way you read. Well,
the scientific method taught me about, what are we observing, what can we know, what is the evidence for it, what are the sources for this evidence, can we test them? And I think for journalism it's a wonderful group of questions to ask, which is what journalists ask, they should ask. well, they should remember that they should ask. How do we know this person is telling the truth? What are some of the questions I could ask to make me understand that this is how they got to this point? What evidence are they using? Is it reliable or unreliable? So that's one thing. I mean, and for reading, well, there's different kinds of reading. If you're reading a novel, I think you have to just open the page from the first page and feel like falling in love. Am I falling into this book? Is this book seducing me by the language and the way, you know, the tone and the rhythm of it? Have I fallen into this universe that the book is building for me? And I'm not sure whether science is useful there, although, you know, as I say, the poetry of the scientific story is quite seductive too. If I'm reading something that's non-fiction, I'll sort of be particular about those other...
More analytic, perhaps.
Yeah. Although, you know, I've got in a novel, as soon as you hear a clang going off in your head and you go, well, hang on a minute, that couldn't possibly happen because X, Y, Z and whatever, and that sort of, suddenly the magic is gone, and that's the end of your enjoyment of that book.
Do you read science fiction?
No, not anymore. I used to as a girl. Why don't I read it anymore? I should. I will.
I must say, apart from Ursula Le Guin, it's a genre that's passed
I
me
used to
by.
read Asimov quite a lot. I haven't written about, you know, reading Asimov, but look, those science fic, they were wonderful. It was about, you know, what would the world look like if we sort of applied this or that thing to it, or they were very much novels about us. They always were about if this tendency is just, you know, ratcheted up and multiplied, what would it look like? And then what would these moral questions be if we had to answer them in another universe? And they're very instructive.
All right, so the transition into science journalism and science broadcasting, I mean, if the mechanics aren't obvious in terms of your lifestyle and everything, it seems obvious. How did that segue into books? How did you come to be a book person?
I started doing science journalism, and then I moved to, you know how it is, and, you know...
yeah, but all our directions are different.
Well, somebody gave me a book to review, and then I read it and I wrote a review, and she liked it, and then and I got another one to review, and someone then said, oh, do you want to do film criticism? And I did some film criticism on the ABC in Victoria for a while, and then someone said, would you like to do a local radio program, which I did for 5 years on 3LO, as it was then, on 774 in Melbourne. And then, would you like to do a national and international current affairs show, which I did on Radio National, which was called Drive. And then I noticed, you know, that you think, well, the thing I really love is reading books and talking to writers. And so when Robert Desai was going off for a year, he wasn't well, he came to me and said, would you step in for me for a year? I said, I'd love to. And then he never came back, and he went off to a stellar writing career. And then I found myself in a wonderful position.
Was that called the book show then?
It was called Books and Writing.
Books and Writing,
because Robert did Books and Writing for about 10 years before I did it.
Actually, I remember him doing that.
Yeah, and I think I did it for about 13 years or so, and then I did the book show for 6.
So how did it feel to step into it? I mean, did you feel nervous, you know, am I out of my depth, or did you just, like a fish being thrown into water? What?
Of course I felt, am I out of my depth? And so I thought, well, I know what to do about that. You just have to get into your depth, and you just have to swat. And I'm a good swatter. So I over-prepare, and I read everything I needed to read, and then I read about 10 other things I didn't need to read just in case. I'm very anxious and neurotic, actually, and it turns out that, you know, I like to sort of have belt and braces approach and other things, and a spare belt and a spare braces. So that meant that I sort of, you know, just learnt and regarded the ABC as my open university, where I was going to learn about things, and I was going to share what I learnt with people who were interested in in talking about it.
Was that Belton Brace's approach just while you were doing your apprenticeship, or have you always continued that? I mean, do you always over-prepare?
Yeah, I always over-prepare.
I think that shows, though, doesn't it? Because you're so across your material.
I'm usually just doing things that I really want to do anyway. So why wouldn't you just get into the depths of everything, since it's, it was your idea in the first place?
Tell us something about the technique of interviewing. Somewhere in the book you say it's like engineering a conversation. She says it's like an engineer builds a bridge from beginning to end. And anyone who used to listen to you obviously knows that you did that beautifully. Is it essentially a simple technique, or is it a very difficult technique?
Well, it's like any, you have to imagine, well, it's imaginative. It's sort of like, if you think about that, trying to look for the trail of my mother, it's looking for the trail of the quarry. The writer is your quarry, and you have to know whether it feeds at night or it sleeps during the day, or whether what's going to eat, or whether it's very shy, or whether it's going to be combative and bite you. You've got to know on what occasions it's bitten other people before and why, and then you've got to really enter the work. And I've always found with most people, if you enter the work, if you show them that you've spent a few hours reading their work, there's nothing more flattering and more warming to people than taking them seriously
and having a genuine engagement with their work.
And I think that people appreciate that. And so then you have to just imagine the conversation. It's sort of like, if I do that, then they'll say this, and then I might do that, and if they say that, then that. So it's a little bit like those those old-fashioned, I don't know whether they ever use this in dance schools, where you're like learning the cha-cha-cha, and you're putting one foot there and one foot there, and then moving back and moving here. But that's all very well. But the problem with people that you're interviewing is that they haven't read the cha-cha-cha steps, and you have to actually then think, and if they do something completely unusual, I have to be prepared to go where they're going, because that can often be more interesting than what you thought. So it's kind of like engineering a bridge for you to go across, but you don't want any of the struts or rivets to be obvious to anybody.
I must say, we were talking this morning, and we're talking about the difference between interviewing for print journalism, which is what I have always done, and interviewing for radio. And I must say, the thought of radio really unnerves me, because with print journalism, you can ask a question and then you can think, no, that's not what I meant, or that sounds stupid, and rephrase it. They can give you an answer and say, no, that's not what I meant, and rephrase it. And then, of course, you go home, you listen to it again, you think, and then you write what you think. But what you're doing is performing. It's on the spot. And you can't have things like 5 seconds of dead silence while the person thinks about your question. So, and it's unnerving for me.
Look, it's just a different skill, and it's a different medium. And the Paris Review interviews, for example, they're really worked interviews. So it might take a year or something for an interviewer to go to the person's house and sit with them and do the interview, and then write it up or record it, and then they go send it back to the writer, and the writer then changes it, because they're a writer, and they want to sound a little bit more serious, or a little bit more funny, or a little bit kinder, or a little bit less grumpy, and they will sort of change it, and then they'll go back, and it's a worked piece. And in fact, there's nothing really spontaneous about it. It's considered. It's a different thing. And journalism, print journalism, is the same thing. I mean, I've done a little bit of this, but and not as much as you, but you can have an argument with someone. You can find them really annoying and irritating and outrageous, and then you can take it back, and you can present them in any way that you want, really, because you can create something that maybe didn't actually happen in the felt, skin to skin kind of meeting. But when you're doing something like that for broadcast, it is a little bit like high wire without a net, and And I think you have to think about it that you're not important. It's the person who's being interviewed is the important one, and it doesn't really matter if you are going to be, if the person wants to humiliate you by being aggressive or implying that you're wrong about something or taking umbrage, that's okay, because
you just have to take it.
No, because it's actually more interesting for the audience to see what they're like. And I just used to think, well, I've done all my work, I've done all the homework, I've got nothing to be embarrassed about, and I don't think I'm asking questions that are unreasonable or for any other reason than just elucidating the work, and there's nothing aggressive about my approach. So whatever's being shown in the transaction is interesting for an audience, and because they don't care whether what I really think. It's about the writer. So that's really how I thought about it.
Can you remember ever having been really stumped by somebody you were interviewing?
I remember being having to use all my powers of psychology on somebody. I did an interview with Joyce Carol Oates in Edinburgh in a sort of setting like this, in front of a big audience. And Joyce Carol Oates, she's been told by her publisher to stop writing so much because they can't publish a Joyce Carol Oates novel every year. So she has to write under, I think, 2 pseudonyms so that she can keep writing. She's just an overproducer and a machine. Sometimes she's fantastic and sometimes she's not quite so fantastic. But I had read a lot of Joyce Carol Oates. You can imagine that, you would... And she was formidable. And she basically started off by not really wanting to have a conversation with me. Like, I'd say, tell me about this or that, and she'd go, oh, I can't remember, or is that a question? Or, she started, and I thought, oh, this is interesting. She's really ornery. And, I had probably about 25 or 30 questions, and I thought to myself, oh, that's interesting. I've just been talking for 10 minutes and I've run through 10 questions. Wonder where this is going to go. And then I remembered thinking that I'd read a couple of books where the dedication was, one was for the Kathleen's, and I think it was a book called Black Water, and it was about the Chappaquiddick incident where the older man and the young girl meet at a party, and then they go over the bridge, and then this fantastic scene of the girl drowning. I think her name was Kathleen, but it was, and the dedication was for the Kathleen. And there was another book, I can't remember the name of it now, and it was something, for the Kylies or for the Kirsties or something. And I thought to myself, well, she's actually sort of trying to say to me that she's thoughtful about the difficult position of younger women. And I thought, I'm a bit younger than her. I'll remind her of, sort of subtle way. So I said to her, I would like to talk about Black Water and your dedication to the Kathleens. And she's just sort of stunned, and she said, what? You've read that book? Nobody's read that book, because it was like 20 years beforehand. And I said, yeah, I read it. And she said, oh, all right then, I give up. Ask me anything. So that, I actually put that in one of a book of collected interviews, because I thought it was quite interesting to see the shift for the audience who's reading it or who's listening to it. But that, I had to just, you just have to keep your wits about you.
You have to think on your feet. I must say, even things like Writers' Weeks always fascinate me, because writers spend 4 years locked in their studies, interacting with their laptop, and it's such a solitary existence. And then all of a sudden they have to come out when the book is published and do endless conversations with you and me, and they've got to perform. And I always presume that there is there must be an introverted side to writers, so that they can spend so much time alone, and then all of a sudden they're in front of a microphone with you.
Well, I've been a writer in a little garret now for a year and a half, and I first of all I started writing at home, and I just found myself just hopeless. There's always washing. You've got to wash, apparently, you've got to cook, and there's a lot of soup that needs to be made, it turns out, and you think, oh, well, I just put that on and that can be cooking while I'm writing, and then I just found it really impossible. So I got a little studio. I got awarded a 3-month little studio at Glenfern, which is a National Trust house near my house. And for 3 months, I had this fantastic room. And then I found, I remember the first week I said to Iola Matthews, who's sort of the den mother of the house, she's there permanently, she oversees the rooms and the writers. I said, I could actually, you've got a kitchen here. I said, I could bring some food and I could be cooking here. And she said, no, you won't be cooking here. You just have to go up to your room. And I've got my door open, and whenever somebody arrives, I listen, I go, I might need to make a cup of coffee now. I'm hopeless as a writer in a garret. I'm too ready to disrupt other people and to be disrupted myself.
You're an extrovert. You're not an introverted writer.
I'm not, but when you actually, it turns out you have to be by yourself and to actually do any of the real writing.
Yeah. The book doesn't appear magically one morning.
No, you have to actually shut the door and do it.
I'm going to call for questions in a moment, and there's a microphone in the central aisle just there. But while you're collecting your thoughts, I'll just ask you something else, which is, what's next for Ramona Koval? I think we're going to get to hear you talking to people about books.
Well, I'm writing my new book for text, and that's really what I'm doing for the most part. But I'm about to start a new little venture in I suppose it's broadcasting still. It's at the monthly website where they have slow TV and Black Ink books and
just
the
in
quarterly
case you
essay.
didn't follow that locution, it's the website of the magazine, The Monthly.
Yeah.
As opposed to a monthly website.
Yeah. It's the website of themonthly.com.au. And we're going to start a conversation about books on The Monthly. So that it's called The Monthly Book, and it'll be a kind of book club as well. So I'll be doing interviews, videoed interviews on that website with writers, and we'll be having an online discussion after a few weeks with all of you who want to join up and comment about the book and tell me what you think about it, and really join into a live video online conversation. It's all very exciting because it's new technology, and we'll see how it goes. But
when does it go live?
Well, the first book's going to be announced on the 25th of March. So that's when
we'll be able to go there then and see.
Yeah. But you can join up now, because on the monthly website, if you type in Ramona Koval, you'll see that you can join up for email responses
Alerts.
to it. So I'll be doing that, and I'll be writing my own books. So it will be a beautiful combination, I imagine, I hope, between devotion to other people's work and, I mean, now that I'm this old and I've read a lot of books, I feel as if I do have something to say about what I think about the world. So it's not just about other people's work, it's about my work too now.
We've got it back. Would you like to ask your question?
Thanks, Ramona. That was fantastic. I'd just like to ask a question about radio as the medium for communication. And I'm fascinated by the way you can't use any body language in radio communication. So I just wondered, looking at you today, you do have lots of body language when you're talking to us. What strategies you put in place to actually really convey your meaning and passion through radio without any body language?
I think you just have to be yourself. It's hard enough to do anything live and engaged with trying to sort of think of strategies. It's possible that I used to talk like this with my hands on the radio as well, when I was imagining speaking to somebody else. You have to have a really good ear. You have to not be afraid of silences too, and wait for other people to finish what they say, and try and let conversations unfold. I think the human voice has got a lot of possibilities that we don't really understand if you're only limited to the voice, and maybe blind people understand this too, that there's a lot you can tell from hesitations, cracks in voice, confidence, quiet, tone, excitement, passion, vulnerability. There's a lot that you can hear, and there's a lot you can respond to. and everybody else is listening and responding to the same things too. So there's a shared conversation. It's a very powerful thing to have a shared conversation with a lot of people all over the world, all over the country. I think it's what we miss in a very digitised, fractured world, which I hope we can find a way to get back again. It'll be all time shifted, of course, because different people listen to different things at the same time. But I think once we work out that you need gatekeepers, you need journalism that is considered, that the number of, there's a lot of good things about blogs and there's a lot of wonderful bloggers, but there are a lot of people saying things that they're saying without any authority. I mean, not the authority that someone imposes on you because you've got a position, but the authority that comes with wisdom
and expertise.
With expertise and with information and with being steeped in knowledge. So I think once people work out that they really need to find some venues, whether they're digital or otherwise, that they can trust, we might get that shared conversation back again, because I'm very interested to see what it does to a democratic conversation if we're all not really tuned into the same kinds of ways of thinking.
And you've just answered a question I had, which I skipped because time was running on.
Oh, good.
About the contribution to the discourse. It's another lady.
My question might be a bit too big, Ramona, but I just wanted to know, how did you decide which books you would include? I mean, I imagine you followed what you loved, but did you ever think things like, I should put more women writers in, I should put more Australian writers in, those sorts of questions? Did you ask yourself, and if you did, how did you deal with them?
Well, what I did was I came home and I sat in my apartment and I looked at all the books I had there, and I thought, why are you here? I asked each book. What is the meaning of you? Why are all of these books about polar exploration here, of North and South Polar exploration? What are these explorers' journals about? What are all these Middle European writers from between the First and the Second World War doing here? Why am I interested in absurdity? Why am I interested in science? Why am I interested in poetry? What are these things that have made it through all of the culls that I talked about? They must mean something to me. I wonder what they do mean. And look, we could all do this. You go home and you look at all your books and you say, that was the part when I was interested in anthropology, or, this was the part where I was interested in whatever you're interested in, and you'll have them and you'll look at them and you'll think, well, what was I like then when I was... Well, why did I choose those authors? What did they mean to me? So I went to those books and I thought, these must be here for a reason. Why are these classics here? What are these Romans and Greeks doing here? What are these encyclopedias for? So I looked at that, and then I thought, well, how did it all begin? And it began with reading, and then it began with my mother, and it began with my mother on her couch reading her books. So that's really how it began. And of course, maybe I should have read more Australian books as a child, but I was from the generation which we didn't have an Australian literature, did we? Until the 70s, when we started taking ourselves seriously, and boutique publishers started to publish Australian writers without them having to go to New York or London. So, we are limited by the times that we grew up and what was presented to us. And as far as the women writers, well, a lot of women writers had a profound effect on me, but it may not have been the kind of writers that you might have read. And it may have been that I was paying attention to writers of the 60s and 70s and ignored the 80s and 90s because I was off doing something else. So it's not a matter of thinking, I should balance these things, because, how can your life isn't balanced. If there was, we're all just stumbling in the dark, aren't we? And the books that I grabbed hold of to sort of steady myself were sometimes accidental too. So that's really what makes the books that made it into the book.
What, apropos of what that lady just asked, it occurs to me though that when you're choosing books for your program, for example, you had to take a more disinterested view. You couldn't just follow your own interests.
Well, I did follow my own interests, because if you're doing 5 days a week and you have to read everything, and you're reading at night and you're reading in the morning and you're reading all weekend, well, you're going to read what you want to read. So, I mean, my view was that if I was interested, but I'm interested in everything. So, I mean, I'm interested in a whole gamut of things. So I sort of assumed that other people would be too.
Just thinking of all the books I ploughed through when I was a literary editor, thinking that I had to. For the
No,
sake of
I
my
never plough. If it doesn't speak to me, it is either the book that is not for me. I think you're allowed to say to yourself, I haven't got enough hours in my life left to read things that I don't want to read. I'm not obligated, you know. I mean, it's a matter of it's not for me, or it's not for me now, or maybe in a year or two when I understand a bit more about the world, I'll be able to read this. Yeah.
This lady here.
There's probably heaps of people that you've met that we were all curious about, but one for me that just struck me while I was listening to you then was, how did you come to know Roger Deakin, and can you tell us a bit about him?
Roger Deakin, what a wonderful friend he was, and I've written about him in my book, because one of the things that you have in your collection of books by friends that you've met along the way, and I met Roger in a yurt in Edinburgh, Charlotte Square. Very odd place to have a yurt, but that was the green room for the writers at the Edinburgh Writers Festival, and he was just leaving, and I just arrived, and the festival director said, "Oh, do you know each other, Roger?" This is Ramona. And he said, "Oh, you're from Australia. I've got a friend in Australia." I said, "Right." And he said, "Do you know Tony Barrell?" And of course I knew Tony Barrell, who's a wonderful documentary maker at the ABC who lived in Sydney. I said, "Oh, as a matter of fact, I do." And he said, "Oh, good." And then he left. And then Tony sent me Roger's book called, what was it called again? Waterlogged. Waterlogged, and said, Roger's coming out to Australia with his book Waterlogged. Waterlogged was a great book because it was about Roger, who was a late bloomer. He'd worked in advertising in London in the 60s, and then in film and all kinds of things. He finally came to writing, and he wouldn't regard himself as a nature writer. He didn't like the idea about nature writing because he just felt it was writing about the world. But he came to this moment where he had an unhappy love affair, and he tried to cure himself by swimming. And he was not the kind of person who would lie on a couch, but he swam, and he started with his moat. He lived in this place in Suffolk, which is a kind of sort of falling down 15th century house that he remade with stuff that he'd found, and then he swam in his moat, and then he swam in a stream, and then he swam in a swimming pool, and then he swam in a river, and he swam at beaches, and he swam all over Britain, and he wrote this fantastic book called Waterlogged. So I interviewed him about Waterlogged, and then he was coming to Australia, and then he said, he'd like to go to Central Australia. Would I like to come with him? And I said, "Oh, okay," because I'd been to Central Australia a bit, and I had some friends there, and I thought I could introduce him to Central Australia. So we went to Central Australia for 3 weeks, me and this completely eccentric Englishman who was partly Monty Python's Flying Circus, partly Scout, English schoolboy Scout, and completely lovely. And, we'd go camping, and he'd set up he set up my swag over here and his swag over there. It was all very proper. And then he'd get undressed for sleeping in the Central Australian desert, and he'd wear sort of a long, those nighties that men used to wear, and a kind of hat. And I thought, it's like actually going camping with Wee Willie Winky. Anyway, so that was Roger. He was wonderful. He died of brain tumours a little while ago, so it's very sad.
Look, we're running out of time, so we may not get 3 in, so maybe quick questions, or we might get a couple in.
I want to take up your line, Ramona, about falling in love with a book. As a reader, I have fallen in love with 3 fictional women in particular. They are Tessa the D'Urbervilles, Emma Bovary, and Anna Karenina.
How could you fall in love with Emma Bovary?
Well, she at least knew she was trapped, and she tried to get out.
I
and
know.
that shows a certain spirit.
I've written about Emma Bovary in my book. I'd be very interested to know what you think, because my mother read Emma Bovary in French, and when I got assigned to reading it in my French class, but writing about it in English, she said to me, a woman ahead of her time. And I thought that was, so I wrote an essay about a woman ahead of her time because my mother was, was giving me this sort of semaphore about her. And I was the only one in my class who wrote an essay about this poor woman who was trapped, who had this boring husband, and everyone else wrote essays about this really awful woman who was unfaithful and caused the death of her child and her own end, and it was all very tragic. And when I went back to read it again for this book, I realised for the first time that Flaubert has you in the classroom with Charles. At the beginning, the first page is about Charles Bovary, her husband, who's supposed to be the bore, and he's a young man and he's shy and he's from the provinces and people are being mean to him. And I thought to myself for the first time, I'm supposed to feel sorry for him. That's why he's put it at the front of the book. And I had to reread it. And then I thought to myself, I can see perhaps what was wrong with Emma Bovary too.
Excuse me, haven't quite reached my question yet.
Oh, sorry.
We've got 2 minutes.
Okay, you'll get it in 1 minute.
1 minute for you, 1 for Ramona.
Okay. Now, all 3 women I've cited were known in the phrase of their day, fallen women. Now, I don't quite know what that says about me.
Well.
But I'd like to ask you, Ramona, which fictional man have you fallen in love with? Taking my case as an example, you may be judged by your choice, but please don't let that constrain your answer.
It's a very simple answer. I only fall in love with men who have got pulses and have got warm blood in their veins. And fictional men don't do it for me.
Nicely put. Now, look, I'm awfully sorry for the 2 people who are waiting there, but the timekeepers here are very strict. And I know we could go on forever, Ramona. I'd love to keep talking, if only we could. But we can't. So thank you very much.
Thank you very
It's been
much.
marvellous.
Thanks very much for coming. Thank you.